Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're exploring what might well be the most challenging parable that Jesus told, the parable of the dishonest steward or manager. Before we dive into any of that, however, if you've not done so already, you might find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, and you'll find the link for that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so without further ado then, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 16, verses 1 to 13. Jesus was continuing his long journey from the region of Galilee to Jerusalem, covering chapter 9, verse 51, all the way to chapter 19, verse 27, what's become known as Luke's travel narrative, and which contains a great deal of Jesus' teaching, including many parables. He was being followed, as we learned in chapter 12, verse 1, along the way by large crowds of people pressing in on him. And we know from previous encounters that this included some of the Pharisees and scribes, as we saw, for example, in chapter 15, verses 1 to 3, where they objected to the kind of company that Jesus was keeping as he hung out with sinners and tax collectors. Now in chapter 15, Jesus had told a set of 3 parables that were all on the theme of being lost and found, and featured people who could be depicted as sinners, as wayward characters. And it culminates in verses 11 to 32 in the parable of the prodigal son, one of the most famous stories Jesus ever told. If we jump a little bit ahead of today's reading, we come to, in chapter 16, verses 19 to 31, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And today's story is kind of sandwiched between those. So we've got stories that focus on sinners, stories that focus on a rich man, and a story that kind of blends the two, acts as a sort of bridging text. And this text will be followed, as we see in verse 14, by an accusation made against the Pharisees that they were angry about the story Jesus told because they were lovers of money, as it puts it. And we have to be very careful, I think, how we deal with what Luke has said there. Yes, there may well, because many of them were very high status people, have been Pharisees who were indeed more in love with money than they ought to have been. But equally, I'm sure there were many of them who were deeply committed to the radical holiness that characterised the Pharisaic movement. And so it's one of those texts where we need to be careful and recognise that there was a degree of conflict at play between Luke's community and some of the established synagogues by that point that Luke's Gospel was written, and that reads in to some of what we find. So in this text, we find Jesus, who is on the road to Jerusalem, as I say, and therefore acting with a great deal of urgency in the kind of things that he teaches. And I think that is reflected time and again in the starkness of the travel narrative. We also have the disciples, including but not limited to the 12. And we know that this section begins by Jesus addressing his disciples while still surrounded by the large crowds, including some of the Pharisees and scribes. And as I say, Jesus will address them directly from verse 14 onwards in this chapter. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third of the 4 canonical Gospels to be written, around 80 to 85 of the Common Era, likely to a community based largely in modern-day Syria and facing persecution from the Roman Empire for being who they were, dealing with the challenges of discipleship under occupation. And I say furthermore, there was this church and synagogue divergence going on at that time as well, so it all feeds in to the challenging picture that they found themselves having to address. And this parable that Luke records is unique to this gospel. It's not found in any of the other three canonical gospels. It's useful before we dive into this text to keep in mind Leviticus chapter 25, verse 36. That contains a stipulation from the law of Moses about not charging interest on loans in order to make profit out of lending financially to people. And one way that people would kind of get round that prohibition at that time would be by receiving payment in kind rather than in cash form. And commodities like oil and grain were commonly used for that purpose. So we need to keep that bit of background in mind as we dive into this text. Now, one of the results of this being, as I say, arguably the most challenging parable in the New Testament, is that it's been subject to a wide variety of interpretations down the centuries. I looked at a range of commentaries when I was grappling with it, and I didn't find all that many points of agreement. So what I want to sort of offer you is more a set of thoughts on the text and different possibilities, so that you might make your own mind up, and that'll be reflected in our questions later on. So having been teaching primarily in the sort of direction of the Pharisees and scribes, if you will, because they'd objected about the company he kept, Jesus now turns, as we hear in verse 1, to his disciples and tells them a parable. And we learn very quickly in verse 1 that the story centres around a rich man and a steward, sometimes referred to as the kind of manager-employee or some sort of version of that, depending on the translation that you're looking at. And this steward was employed to manage the wealth of this wealthy man. Now, what that meant in practice was collecting rent and debts on behalf of their bosses. And stewards were allowed, managers were allowed to add a bit extra on for themselves. That was how they made their personal profits. When they went round taking payments, therefore, they were taking not just what was owed, but that bit extra from which their wages came. Now, when it talks of the steward squandering the wealth of the rich man in the latter part of verse 1, we could equally well translate squandered as scattered. And that links back all the way to chapter 1, verse 51, and to the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, in which we're told that God scatters the proud in their conceit. So there's that connection which points to the kind of gospel reversals we've seen going on all along in this section, from the welcoming back of the prodigal son despite his squandering of half his family's inheritance, through to the reversal of fortunes after death between the rich man and Lazarus in the parable that follows this one. Now, when we look at the parables of Jesus, quite often we can think about what do the characters represent, or who do they represent? Tom Wright, in his interpretation of this passage, argues that when anybody read a parable about masters and servants, or masters and stewards in this case perhaps, they would instantly associate that master, or wealthy person in this case, with God, and the steward with the people of Israel. Now, his view seems to be in the minority from what I found with my looking into this passage. Instead, I think the majority of scholars seem to agree that we can't just associate the figure of the master with God or with Jesus here. But what we can say, I think, is that when the steward is called in verse 2 to account for his actions in how he has managed the rich man's wealth, he finds himself in a really difficult position. And that's because we hear in verse 3 that he was both too ashamed to beg and no good at manual work. So in other words, once he was fired, he would have no way of supporting himself. Presumably he didn't have anything to fall back on as such. And so in verse 4, we hear him making a decision about how he's going to be able to become a recipient of the hospitality of others. He wants to be welcomed into people's homes, and his scheme for doing that is essentially to knock some of the repayments off of the debts. Now, the steward summons the rich man's debtors one by one and asks them what they owe, as we see in verse 5. And the large amounts of goods that we learn that he was in charge of in verses 6 and 7 suggest that he was a very high status person. And his relationship with those debtors would normally have had a kind of client-patron kind of relation to it, with very clear kind of power dynamic. But by letting them off some of their debt, the steward transforms those relationships into something much more egalitarian and mutual, something much more like friendship rather than a client-patron relationship. And that seems to be at the heart of his strategy for them being able to find a safe place to go, to be able to be offered hospitality. Now, this reduction that the steward offers in these debts, I say, could reflect him taking off that extra bit that he'd added on for himself in order to curry favour. It could be part of his plan. Equally, it could be that because you weren't allowed to make a profit by adding financial interest onto loans, that his boss had got him to add these extra bits on as payments in kind. And therefore it would have put the boss in a really difficult position to examine too closely what the steward was doing by letting these extra bits drop, because it would have called into question the rich man's own sharp business practices. So there's a couple of different slants from which one can come at this, and what we see in verse 8 when the rich man commends the steward for his behaviour. And indeed, that commendation of the steward in verse 8 is really the heart of this passage. And when it's translated as shrewd in some commentaries, when it describes said steward, that could also be translated as prudent or as wise. It's the same Greek word for all three. So then that gives us, again, different slants on what's going on. Now, some have argued, as I say, that basically the steward was doing this to curry favour, and that in some sense that acquired a degree of respect from the rich man, that he was showing some initiative. It could be that he was doing something that would expose his boss, and therefore he was perhaps trying to make sure that he was kept in his job after all. Other commentators have argued that he was being, the rich man was being sarcastic in his commendation of the steward. Again, we don't know. I think what we can say is that Luke himself seems to find it quite difficult to know what to do with this text. The great New Testament scholar C.H. Dodd suggests that Luke kind of offers almost three different possible endings to the sermon, three different punchlines. So in verse 8, we've got this idea perhaps that the children of light need to be more shrewd or prudent or wise, depending on how we translate it, than the children of the world, as it were. It's one interpretation. Another, based on verse 9, might suggest that if we find ourselves being the recipients of dishonest wealth for whatever reason, then we should use it to make friends or perhaps do kindnesses, you could say. And finally, based on verses 10 to 12, it has been argued, and what this is all about is saying that we need to show that we can be prudent and wise and shrewd in our management of ordinary wealth, in inverted commas, whatever that is, if we're going to be able to be trusted with true riches in the kingdom of heaven. And there's a contrast made here between the steward being welcomed into people's homes that we saw in verse 4, and this talk of eternal homes, eternal salvation. Now again, this reflects different possible readings. So Tom Wright argues with his view that the rich man represents God and the steward represents Israel, that what was going on in this parable was essentially a failure on behalf of the people of Israel to properly take care of what God had entrusted to them by failing to step out of their legal comfort zone, as it were, and build relationships across borders and this is what they were being taken to task for. Wright believes that Luke's Gospel was written considerably earlier than the dating I've given, before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70, and thus he sees the eternal homes that are talked about towards the end of this parable being about the shelter that the people of Israel would need when God's judgment came to pass in the destruction of their city and its temple. So that's one view. Rachel Mann's view, on the other hand, is really interesting. She says that if we take God to be the rich man and the steward to sort of represent us, is what this parable is about, fundamentally showing us our complicity in unjust systems, and that we can't so easily wriggle out of that or set ourselves as morally above everybody else, which is a really interesting thing to think about when we look at issues like climate change and ethical consumerism and so on. How far can we step out of those systems around us that do lead to oppression and injustice? Everything, regardless of what else one might want to say, really comes to a head in verse 13, where Jesus makes it clear that we cannot serve Mammon and God at the same time, because we'll either hate one and love the other, or vice versa. Now, the word mammon is really interesting. Some Bible translations, like the NRSV for example, translate this word as wealth, and that is part of its meaning, but it's broader than that too. It includes things like status and power and titles and honour and other things that might become our idols, that might seduce us and pull us away from God. So it's a broader term. And I think if we wrestle with verse 13, it really perhaps counters some of the more questionable interpretations that we might want to come up with out of this challenging parable. So as I said when we began diving into the detail, I've tried to offer you a range of perspectives on what is undoubtedly a very difficult text. When I first talked about this text in one of the churches that I serve, I was asked if what was actually written in the reading was correct, or whether I'd made a typo or something like that. Such was the dissonance that it created for people. But as I say, there are many different ways of looking at it. And with that in mind, we now turn to our questions for this week.